Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. This week, we're going to be discussing wildfires. So a little bit of background here. I grew up entirely in Southern California. And in growing up in Southern California, wildfire has always been just a scary part of life. And every year, we constantly wondered if we would have to evacuate and then just await the news that we could return home. So for a long time, I had no idea how important fire could be to the environment, and I just wished that it didn't happen. But now that I've been in college studying specifically environmental biology for a while, I have come to realize how important fire can be to maintaining balance in quite a few different ecosystems. So we're going to discuss that for the most part. We're not going to be focusing on the money that is reported in the news when they show buildings, specifically homes, being lost to these massive blazing wildfires that occur all over the world. Again, in California, this is pretty much at any point in the year we can turn on the news and find a fire burning somewhere because California is always on fire. But the news really just does show those homes being lost, this scorched wilderness, the emergency personnel, like the firefighters, working to keep people safe and help them get to these evacuation areas. And also many interviews with these scared civilians talking about how awful the event is and how terrified they were to lose their home or how bad it is that they did lose their home. With the recent years, the fires being so bad, one thing that's been happening, at least in my area, is homeowners insurance is either going up or many of us are being dropped from our insurance companies and needing to scramble to find new ones because they don't want to cover homes in these high-risk areas, which is an unfortunate side effect of these constant wildfires, but something that's usually ignored in the news and in all of these reports is the benefit of the fire and the risks that would be associated with avoiding these fires entirely if they weren't actually a part of our reality. So let's get into a little bit about the risks of the fire and the benefits. So some obvious risks when the fires do happen is that people may be trapped, injured, or unfortunately even perish as a result of the fire for one reason or another. Perhaps they refuse to evacuate. At least growing up, I definitely knew of people with the I'm not going to evacuate, I live here and I go down with my home kind of attitude, which is not advised. If you're being asked to evacuate, there's a good reason, please evacuate. Structures may be lost. They may be a modern structure that just went up or a historical one that has been there for hundreds of years. Fire doesn't really discriminate and it doesn't know the difference. And of course, wildlife may be killed. I know that the news does show much of the injured and killed wildlife in the after effects of a wildfire to bring that sympathetic feeling out in the news readers or the viewers. And also there is a risk that soil may be harmed and charred, ecosystems may be destroyed, and there are possible long-term effects like the soil erosion because the vegetation is not there to hold it in place and resulting in massive mudslides when the rain does come back eventually. And the mudslides where I live especially are a big problem post-wildfire. But there are some obvious benefits that do tend to get mentioned but are kind of downplayed. It does clear out the dead plant matter that does accumulate there, which also is part of the fuel for these fires, and the more dead plant matter there, the more intense these fires do tend to be. And it also will add nutrients to the soil because it breaks down all the dead stuff faster to return those nutrients back into the soil, where they can then be utilized by the growing plants and trickle back through the ecosystem. Let's talk about how some ecosystems actually resist or even depend on these wildfires, and a little bit about why it's not necessarily a good reason to suppress wildfire entirely. So the first term we need to address here is pyrophyte, which is a fancy word for a fire-resistant plant. This word will also be used to refer to either plants that are, again, resistant to fires and that they can survive fires up to a certain extent, or plants that in some way utilize wildfire in their reproduction cycle. Now, the first thing is the withstand fire. And plants can do this by having very great thermal insulation, like very thick bark. We see this in trees that live in these very fire-prone landscapes. And this is why when a fire goes through, you'll still have those trees and they'll still be able to survive. They'll still be alive, even when everything else seems to be absolutely gone and completely just decimated. And there's also, along with that, these trees often have very high tops, making the canopy very high up out of reach of the fire, so that their photosynthetic leaves are still intact, so that they can still carry out that process. They can still make the sugars that carry out their metabolic processes and keep them alive. Some plants also have these dormant shoots that exist way below the soil, but can then pop up and resprout when the plant is severely damaged. And that's not necessarily it's not the same as a seed growing. It's a shoot that is literally there. It is still the same plant. It just has a backup in case of emergency, is probably the best way to put it. And then there are some plants that will produce oils within their tissues that make them less flammable. And that is a pretty obvious way to resist being burned, because if you're less flammable up to a certain extent, you're probably going to survive most fires, assuming they are not extremely intense and get to the point where your oils are no longer able to work. But there are also the plants that depend on this fire for reproduction. Now, scarification is a thing that some seeds need in order to germinate, and this can come in as the seed coat either needs to be damaged in some way physically. Sometimes that happens by passing through the digestive system of an animal or being gnawed on. However, this can also refer to being exposed and damaged in some way by fire. It depends on the plant, but some seeds may need that exposure to the heat to melt away parts of the seed coat. It's thought that some chemical released by the fire or the exposure to the smoke also helps some plants then germinate. A lot of times these same plants don't only produce the seeds that need the fire to sprout, they'll also produce seeds that will sprout on their own. So these plants kind of have a double protection in their next generation. However, for long-term survival, it is necessary to have that periodic wildfire. And also, you'll see pine trees with cones that won't release from the tree because they'll be stuck with a resin, and those cones will also be glued shut. And these particular cones will then release when a fire does come through, and the heat from the fire melts those resins and then releases those seeds, and then new pine trees can then grow. Of course, some of these plants with the seeds that need wildfire actually produce chemicals that promote the fire growing bigger and spreading and are highly flammable. But that is necessary for the life cycle of those particular plants. So the sacrifice of the older generation of plant is necessary for more germination and the continuation of those species. And these species are often in key roles in those ecosystems. The fire will also then fertilize the soil by breaking down that dead plant matter that's been accumulating possibly over years and adding it much quicker back into the soil so that those nutrients can continue to cycle through the ecosystem. And there are studies that note that when a wildfire does go through, we will see very prolific flowering, meaning that the fire itself is promoting flowering of certain plants. And fires will also kill the plants that are not fire adapted and may not be actually native to those environments. In many cases, fires help keep grasslands as grasslands and other ecosystems as their particular ecosystems by killing the plants from other places that are now sprouting and growing up in those particular locations, which is my final point in this particular section, that the fire keeps certain ecosystems from encroaching into others. Again, the example being like a grassland bordered by a forest. The fire will then kill the saplings that are beginning to encroach on the grassland because the grasses will germinate much faster than the trees on the forest edge can. So historically, prevention was the key to dealing with wildfire. We just didn't have all the information we have now about it being important to ecosystems. And these fires were put out at all costs and not allowed to burn. The idea was that it's killing these ecosystems. The only way to protect them is to put the fires out, and also the fires are damaging structures, so obviously they're bad. Just don't let it happen. However, the result of this was actually bigger and more intense fires because there was much more fuel for the fires when they did break out after the natural cycle was not allowed to continue for long enough. And there's also been records of a very gradual disappearance of these fire-dependent species, especially the ones that rely on fire for their germination. So fast forward to present day, you see things like the controlled burns that simulate natural wildfires and help restore the balance of the wildfire-dependent ecosystems while keeping that fire in check and protecting these structures that have been man-made and are necessary for our modern existence. However, we still see a high risk in developed areas where controlled burns are not a reasonable option because there are so many homes. And in the areas with little fire, we're seeing more invasive species taking over the landscape, which is threatening native species and ecosystems, especially in places like California, which have very endangered coastal sage scrub ecosystems. Our chaparral, which is very similar to other ecosystems in the Mediterranean, is being taken over by these Mediterranean grasses that are simply outcompeting ours. But the problem there is we have what is also known as a Mediterranean ecosystem, so it's a little bit more complicated here since the species that are invading are also adapted to the same things our species are for the most part. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, but that is a completely different topic than what we're talking about today. I would like to point out some of the resources I have linked below today. They use many of the same studies that paved the way for the whole fire ecology field. which is specifically a field of study that looks at how wildfires impact the environment and their role in the ecosystem and the greater study of ecology. Specifically, the smokybear.com link that I have linked has a very nice, very simple breakdown of some very specific ecosystems that are affected by fire and what fire actually does for those ecosystems. For now, that's about all I have for you. So next time we're seeing fire in the news, which is going to happen very soon as California and I'm sure other places as well are beginning to head into their fire season. Just keep in mind that while news sources are showing all of the negatives and the financial losses that these fires cause and the damages, there is also a natural reason why they happen. They are beneficial to the ecosystem, and there are two sides to every coin. So I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, night, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.